Okay, can it get any better than what we had last Saturday during week 6 of college football? Well, we're going to try here in week 7, and we think we've got some nice matchups, and we bring in Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com to talk it up as we get further into conference play and really grind down these rankings. And some men are going to step up this week, Joe, and the boys are going to be pushed to the side in some of these matchups. So let's start on a Thursday night with the Stanford team that's lost 2 games now, and they got to be kicking themselves for the Notre Dame loss on the road, as well as the one we talked about several times, the USC game. But it's a Stanford team with 2 losses taking on Connor Halliday and Washington State.
Very interesting matchup, Marky. Look at what Stanford did on the road last weekend in South Bend. Only accumulated 205 total yards of offense, was held to 47 rushing yards, averaged 1.5 yards per carry against Notre Dame. They lost the turnover battle. Not going to get it done in the Pac-12 conference, but they're playing a team in Washington State who dropped a home game last week 60-59 with their quarterback Connor Halliday setting the FBS passing record. An incredible matchup down the wire where Washington State missed a 19-yard field goal. When you look at this matchup, Washington State's not that solid in terms of run defense or pass defense. It favors Stanford in this matchup, but psychologically, where is Stanford heading up into this ballgame with Washington State? I think Stanford wins this ballgame, but it's very close and a lot closer than people think, calling for about a 7-point victory by the Cardinal. I just don't like the way they're moving the football on the offensive end, one-dimensional with Kevin Hogan, not really getting the running attack going like they're normally doing. And you saw it last week, 205 total yards against a solid Notre Dame defense. They're going to be pressured by Connor Halliday in this matchup.
All right, there's our Thursday night matchup, Washington State and Stanford, the Cardinal down to number 25 in the country. I certainly think that they're better than that, but with 2 early season losses, that's where they stand. So let's move it ahead to noon, Joe, on Saturday, where Florida State takes on Syracuse. The Orange, I don't know if they can really handle this matchup with Florida State. The Seminoles 59-3, something in that range last year against the Cuse. This one at the Carrier Dome. While all those teams seem to be knocking each other off from 2 to about 7 or 8 in the rankings last week, Florida State pulled through against Wake Forest, and they seem to be in good shape, headed toward the finish line at number 1.
Florida State proved that they were at least in the mention for the playoff last week with a convincing 43-3 victory over Wake Forest. Was the first time all year that I saw Florida State's defense step up and dominate a ball game. When you look at this matchup heading up against Syracuse in the Carrier Dome, Mark, 2 mentions that you have to think about. Carlos Williams, the starting running back, is questionable with an ankle injury, and Rashad Green is doubtful for this ball game. So that's going to put a lot of pressure on Jameis Winston and some other people to step up. I think Florida State outmatches Syracuse on both sides of the ball. You look at a Syracuse on Friday night and really wasn't that competitive. They're not getting great quarterback play by their quarterback, Terrell Hunt. He's not making solid decisions in the passing game, putting a lot of pressure on the offensive line. I think this matchup favors Florida State in this game, but due to the injuries might be a little bit closer than people think because other players have to step up, and it is in the Carrier Dome where crazier things have happened.
No question about that. Looking forward to that Florida State-Notre Dame matchup in a few weeks to see if Florida State can be that dominant against a good team and to see how good Notre Dame is. We've seen them against Stanford now, but to see them against an explosive team with playmakers all over the place in Florida State should be interesting once we get to that point. Texas-Oklahoma, of course, the Red River rivalry, traditional matchup, loses a little luster now that Oklahoma's been knocked off. They need to be perfect the rest of the way and hope for things to fall into place, taking on Texas, and the Sooners come in at number 11.
Very disappointing performance by Oklahoma on the road in Fort Worth. I know the last 2 ball games against TCU were decided by 10 points, and Oklahoma won both of those ball games. I knew that TCU matched up very well against Oklahoma, but in the end, I still thought the Sooners were the best team in the country heading into that matchup last weekend. Very disappointing performance when you look at Trevor Knight, 14 of 35 for 301 yards, was pressured by that TCU defense. And really, Bob Stoops, again, didn't come up in a big game. I know he won the Sugar Bowl last year with a convincing victory over Alabama, but over the last few years now, in big ball games, it looks like the Sooners were outcoached. I think Gary Patterson did an excellent job in game planning for the Sooners, and you really have to credit Trev Boykin for his performance, 318 yards, 77, dominating performance by Trev Boykin. Now they're going up against a team in Texas that had a very solid defensive effort up against Bryce Petty last week. They held Bryce Petty to 7 of 22 passing, 111 yards on the day. That's a solid performance in a team in Baylor that's averaging 51 points per game, number 1 in the country. So you have to credit Charlie Strong and that offense and defensive staff for really putting together a solid game plan. I like Charlie Strong in this matchup because, in my opinion, he's a better big game coach than Bob Stoops. I know he might not have the talent, but this is Texas's season right now. You could forget about what they did in the previous 6 weeks. This will make or break Texas's season. Charlie Strong understands the rivalry. I think Texas finds a way to upset Oklahoma in this matchup.
And in the one matchup they had on national TV with most of the college football world watching them against UCLA, I know that the Bruins may not be quite as strong as we envisioned in the preseason, but Texas did step up and play a really strong game and look much better than what they had showed against BYU in almost upsetting UCLA. So I'm with you on that one, definitely. And we saw it last year where Texas really took it to Oklahoma, and that Texas team lost 5 games. Then, of course, Oklahoma, of course, went on to win the Sugar Bowl. We've got a matchup, Joe, in the SEC Eastern Division that's going to go a long way in determining who's the best team in this division and who's going to face a really strong team, of course, in the championship game in that conference, with Missouri putting their foot down last year against Georgia, and that was really the statement game that got them off and running toward the SEC Eastern Division Championship after the disappointing loss to Indiana. Mizzou is now bounced back. They're back in the rankings. They're back in the Eastern Division hunt. Georgia at number 13. So your thoughts about Tigers and Dogs in this game in Columbia?
Well, I like my Dogs in this matchup, Mark, for a couple of reasons. When you look at Missouri, they're going to have a week off to prepare for this game. They're surrendering about 178 yards rushing on the year, giving up about 200 in the passing defense, so they're very solid in the secondary. But you look at the flip side with Georgia, they're going to get Malcolm Mitchell back. He came back last week from the injury, from the ACL, only had 1 reception for 11 yards. Justin Scott Wesley, their other big play wide receiver, was supposed to play. He did not. I expect them to play on the road in Columbia this weekend. Both Mitchell and Wesley will add depth to the wide receiver position, and I like the offensive line played by Georgia going up against a solid defensive front in Missouri, but they're not that solid in run support. They're better in pass rushing and speed off the edge. I think Georgia holds the edge on the offensive line. I look for Gurley, Nick Chubb to have big days, and I think Georgia's offensive line wears down Missouri to a convincing win on Saturday.
Yeah, I think the Dogs have a lot of matchup advantages over this Missouri Tigers team, but I think Matty Mock certainly has a puncher's chance in the passing game against Georgia's secondary that's a bit thin, bit young, and not playing that well right now against better passing teams, and Missouri certainly fills that void. In the ACC, I get these divisions mixed up all the time. The Coastal Division, you've got a blanket that you can throw over all these teams. So this is another pivotal matchup when you talk about Duke, who was able to escape with a 5-3 record last year and win it against Georgia Tech, who hasn't lost a game. The schedule's been very weak, but at the same time, the Jackets came through with a big division win against Miami last week. So you got Georgia Tech hosting Duke in a key division game.
Georgia Tech has owned this rivalry over the last 11 matchups by an average margin of victory at 21 points per game. So this really favors Georgia Tech in this ball game. I like the way Georgia Tech is playing. They're sort of going under the radar, Mark, in terms of really surprising teams. They picked up a solid road victory 3 weeks ago in Lane Stadium in Blacksburg tonight followed that up with a very solid victory last week over Miami. Miami, prior to that, had won 5 straight against Georgia Tech. So that was a solid home victory over, in my opinion, a very physical and speedy defense in the Hurricanes led by Denzel Perryman. I like Georgia Tech's ability on the offensive end to put a lot of pressure on Duke's defense. When you saw Duke match up against Miami, not that great in run support. So I think this game favors Georgia Tech, and I think Georgia Tech rolls to a big victory on Saturday. I know Duke has a sophisticated passing game with David Cutcliffe, but in my opinion, I like the linebacker play by Georgia Tech as well. I think Anthony Boone is in for a long day on Saturday.
All right, Joe, we come up on a couple of matchups of the week in these specific conferences. First in the SEC at 3:30 with Auburn and Mississippi State. Tigers unscathed, and they've taken out Arkansas. They've taken out LSU in a big way, and Kansas State to date looked very impressive against an LSU team that's obviously having all sorts of issues moving the football against decent competition. And Mississippi State's performance against Texas A&M was dominant in that front seven on defense. Reggie Brown with 3 interceptions as Texas A&M marched down the field with little resistance on the first drive of the game, and then Mississippi State got it together and really took advantage of what I thought their advantage matchup was, and that's in the front seven on defense against that Texas A&M offensive line that gave up 4 sacks of Kenny Hill in that game. Auburn, a road favorite at Mississippi State.
Well, I really think at this point in the season, Auburn is the best team in the country. I know I mentioned Florida State. They are number 2. I had Florida State number 1, but you look at what Auburn was able to do last week on the Plains against a solid defensive front led by John Chavis and that LSU Tiger team. They put up 566 total yards on LSU, rushed for 298 yards, 6.1 yards per carry. You look at their quarterback, Nick Marshall, 4 touchdowns, 2 on the ground, 2 through the air, and Sammy Coates finally got involved on the offense, 4 receptions for 144 yards. A solid offensive effort in dominating LSU. Prior to that matchup, over the last 5 years, LSU owned Auburn. They were 4-1 overall since 2009. So that was a gutty victory by the Auburn Tigers and really running away with that matchup. On the flip side, when you look at Mississippi State and what they were able to do against Texas A&M, they really dominated on the defensive side of the ball against Kenny Hill. You mentioned it, 4 sacks. Prior to that, Kenny Hill was only sacked on the season mark 3 times all year. They created 4 turnovers, and Dak Prescott 5 total touchdowns. You talk about Mississippi State and Auburn, 2 of the most dynamic quarterbacks in the SEC, and Nick Marshall and Dak Prescott. But when you look at Mississippi State's defense, they're giving up 328 passing yards per game. I think that's the difference. Nick Marshall really coming along in the passing game. I think those big play wide receivers are Sammy Coates and Williams will stretch Mississippi State. And when you talk about tempo, nobody does it better than the Auburn Tigers. They're solid in run support. I like Auburn in this matchup. They've also dominated the series over the last 5 years. Since 2009, 4-1 overall by an average margin of victory of 9.7 points per game. I like Nick Marshall and the Tigers in this matchup.
And Auburn's dominated that series for a long, long time before that at 56-24 overall. Now we get to a game here where, Joe, I've got to tell you that I was pleased to see that the voters really gave credit to Arizona and TCU, teams that were either, in Arizona's case, out of the top 25, and TCU's case, barely in at number 25, very much gave them credit. And usually you see a team that's unranked and they come up with a monumental win. Even if they're undefeated early in the season, they're going to jump in at 17 or 18, something in that range, but really gave them credit and said, forget what we thought preseason. Let's grade these teams based on what they've given us on the field. And for TCU, that's been dominance over bad competition. But when they get Oklahoma at home, who was supposed to be the top 3 team in the country, they win that game. And for Arizona, it was winning at Oregon on a Thursday night. At Oregon, very impressive there for the Cats at 5-0. So we focus on the Big 12, and finally we get to see Baylor face a team with a pulse in TCU. So we got a couple top 10 teams in the Bears and the Horned Frogs.
I, I was very impressed with the Longhorns for a couple of reasons. Bryce Petty was 7 of 22 for 111 yards, and they really were forced to play Texas style of game in that game, a blue-collar, ground and pound defensive battle that really would favor Texas in that matchup. But lo and behold, you watched what Baylor was able to do, and they really adapted to that style of play on the field. That's why I like what Baylor was able to do. You bring up a team like Oregon over the last couple of years, losing to Stanford. They could not adapt to Stanford's blue-collar style of play, and that's why I wasn't that high on Oregon over the last couple of years, especially on the road. But you talk about a Baylor team that adapted. They didn't have their best effort with Bryce Petty, 7 of 22, and they were still able to pick up a 21-point victory in Austin, which is a solid effort. And now they're coming back home in Waco. They're in a new stadium. I like Baylor on the offensive side of the ball for what they're able to do. I think they'll be able to stretch TCU. I don't think Trev Boykin and the offense will be able to keep up. This is an improved Baylor defense as well, and I think Baylor gets a convincing victory on Saturday.
Okay, Joe, we stay in that 3:30 time window. It's going to be a good one when you talk Baylor and TCU, also the Auburn-Mississippi State game, North Carolina-Notre Dame, and also this one that was huge a week ago nationally. It's still big nationally, but remains huge in the Pac-12 with UCLA taking on Oregon. These two teams coming off a loss, so the rankings take a hit, especially for the Bruins at number 18 because they haven't been impressive the entire season, but UCLA still controls, as both teams do, their own destiny within this conference. So it's Oregon and it's UCLA.
Both teams disappointing when you look at Oregon. Marcus Mariota was sacked 5 times by that Wildcat defense, put a lot of pressure on that offensive line. And on the flip side, Brett Hundley and those quarterbacks for UCLA, Mark, sacked a total of 22 times on the season. So both offenses have suspect offensive lines. You look at the matchup overall since 2006, the visitor is 1-6 overall, so doesn't really fare well for Oregon on the road in the Rose Bowl. But I like UCLA in this matchup because of their defense. I know they're not playing like we've seen them play last year, but they're very opportunistic at the right times, and they're scoring off their turnovers. I think that's the difference. I think Mariota's a solid quarterback, 15 touchdowns, no INTs, but in my opinion, Brett Hundley, the better quarterback, and I like him at home. I think UCLA and Jim Mora find a way to right the ship, and they get a convincing home victory over Oregon on Saturday. Not sold on the Ducks on the road outside of Autzen Stadium.
Yeah, and it's a bit disturbing that UCLA had that game after Brett Hundley threw a beautiful touchdown pass to take the lead 28-27 with about 3 and change left in that game, and they allowed Utah and Travis Wilson to go right down the field and kick the game-winning field goal. UCLA made a desperate effort to use 25-30 seconds to get in field goal range and missed a mammoth kick and lost that one to Utah at home. So a home loss for UCLA, completely unexpected there as a 14-point favorite. So we go back to the SEC, Joe, and we got Alabama and Arkansas. You would expect the Tide to be very motivated. Arkansas, a different team than they were last year. They're much more able to cope with the grind in the SEC West. I don't know that they're going to finish anywhere but last or next to last. But we can clearly see with the way that they played for 3 quarters against Auburn and for the entire game against Texas A&M that Arkansas has something going in under Brett Bielema. So we've got the Tide going to Arkansas and Alabama trying to right the ship and get back in control of the SEC West.
Well, first, you knew I liked Ole Miss last week. I said I was calling for the upset. They got it. This is not the same Alabama team. And quickly, before I break it down, I know you said that the voters gave credit to TCU for their monumental victory in Arizona. Well, how come they didn't give the credit for what Ole Miss was able to do and drop Alabama down to about a number 11 or number 12? I'm shocked that the Alabama Crimson Tide are sitting at number 7 after a road loss to Ole Miss, who was really not really that in the top 20 at that point. So sort of unbalanced in terms of what they did to Alabama and keeping them at number 7. In my opinion, Alabama should be around number 12 or number 13. They're not winning the turnover battle. Prior to that game, going in on the road in Oxford, they were -3 in turnover margin. They lost the turnover battle again, 2-1 to the Rebels. The one turnover they did get was a suspect call where there was a face mask. Could have been a flag, and that would have been negated, but they did score the touchdown off of that to take a 14-3 lead over Ole Miss and Hugh Freeze. But credit that coaching staff. They outscored Alabama 20-3 in the second half. Bo Wallace, 18-31, 251 yards, all 3 touchdowns in the second half, and they pulled off the victory. That Ole Miss defense, Mark, held Alabama to 228 passing yards. Before that, they were averaging 335 yards a game, and they rushed for 168. They were averaging 222 yards a game. So that's a solid effort by Ole Miss and that defensive staff for rising to the occasion, and they held Amari Cooper to only 9 receptions for 91 yards, a modest 91 yards. He was a non-factor in that matchup. The only concern I have about Arkansas in this game is, number one, can their secondary keep up with Alabama's wideouts, Amari Cooper, Christian Jones, and DeAndrew White? And the other, on the flip side, Alabama, which is only giving up 62 rushing yards per game, they're going to stuff the box against Brett Bielema and that offensive line for Arkansas. Can Brandon Allen throw over the top of that defense and stretch that secondary? That's the only concern I have for this game. I think Arkansas can play toe-to-toe with Alabama. I think in the end, though, Alabama picks up the victory because they're more diversified and balanced on the offensive end. I just don't know if Brandon Allen could throw over the top of that defense the way Bo Wallace and the Rebels were able to.
All right, Joe, going to step in the Big Ten very briefly because it's not a marquee weekend in the Big Ten, no question about that, with Michigan State taking on Purdue, and Ohio State's off this week. But we've got we're going to go back as a brand name game, Penn State and Michigan, with this game in the Big House. And Devin Gardner's been named as Brady Hook starter for the rest of the season, so no Shane Morris there. I think there might be a little bit more working than football in that decision. But Penn State going on the road, and the Nittany Lions, they did have the loss, surprisingly, to Northwestern at home. Looked extremely inept in that game. Couldn't block anyone off Christian Hackenberg. But they take on Michigan. I guess Michigan, despite all the issues, they have a number of statement games that they could continue to get a chance and an opportunity to salvage its season. Penn State, Michigan State, Ohio State. But again, the game was right there for them to win last week, and they couldn't get the big play. Again, they don't have the guys that can make game-changing plays in the clutch, and they couldn't get it done against Rutgers on that final drive. So we got Penn State still playing for something, Michigan apparently out of it in the Big Ten.
Very interesting matchup because I don't like both teams in terms of the way they're playing. I mean, Penn State can very well be 2-3 on the year. You could talk about 2 of their victories against UCF, a game changer at the end where they kicked a field goal. They got pushed to the limit, and Rutgers really pushed them to the limit, leading that ball game 10-6, and Christian Hackenberg and that offense able to pull out a late victory on the road. But when you look at this Michigan team overall in defense, they're -13 in turnover margin on the year, Mark. I don't know how you can win ball games when you're -13 through week number 6 now, through 6 weeks of the season. To be a -13 on the year is unheard of. So they lost the turnover battle again. Gary Nova tore up that secondary, 3 touchdowns, no INTs. He's been a very inconsistent quarterback for Rutgers. Christian Hackenberg, in my opinion, a lot better than Gary Nova. He's been a little inconsistent as well, but I like James Franklin as head coach. Bottom line, I think he's the right guy for the Penn State job. He has his teams in position to win, and if you're asking me, Brady Hoke lost this team weeks ago. I like James Franklin and the Nittany Lions on the road. I don't see any way Michigan can win this ball game with or without Devin Gardner at the helmet. I don't think it matters. There's so much turmoil surrounding this team. It's just so much negativity. I don't see any way how they win this game. I think Penn State's a much better coached team on all ends.
Yeah, you bring up the negativity. In a sense, I'm surprised that they competed as well as they did at Rutgers and taking that game down to the last play of the game, 26-24. And for the Big House being close to filled, I don't know if they're going to fill the whole thing, but 100,000 people, it's got to be the least influential 100,000 in college football to date. So being on the road shouldn't be an issue with Penn State facing a game in the Big House, because it is no home field advantage for Michigan anymore. And it was just a point about a year and a half ago where Brady Hoke was not losing any games at home. They were all on the road, and now no home field advantage for the Wolverines. So 2 more games to hit you with, Joe. We've got the huge one, the other huge one in the SEC with Ole Miss taking on Texas A&M. We know how good the Rebels looked against Alabama. We got the good Bo Wallace, the clutch Bo Wallace in the fourth quarter, and an Ole Miss defense that was just lights out when it had to be against the Tide in taking on Blake Sims, and a Texas A&M team that showed some of the warts that we expected preseason, but they played so well against South Carolina and against some inferior football teams that we maybe lost sight of this Texas A&M team still not being where Kevin Sumlin seems to be taking it, and they have issues on defense. They're really not that physical and blocking some people up front and protecting Kenny Hill as well.
I've been talking to a lot of people expecting A&M to knock off Ole Miss this weekend. I just don't see it. I like the veteran leadership by Bo Wallace. Now, granted, he's been inconsistent, I'll give you that, but he is a senior. And a senior quarterback going into Kyle Field, I like his chances, and I like the way the defensive secondary is playing. Prior to that matchup with Alabama, they were giving up 133 total yards in the passing defense. It's now 158. Their defensive backs can play man-to-man coverage. They come up in run support. Kamdichi and that defensive line, very, very solid against the run. And I like Hugh Freeze as head coach. I think that this team will be focused. I think they have a goal in place. And I like Bo Wallace and the Rebels to knock off Kenny Hill. You look at what Mississippi State was able to do last week, collapsing the pocket, getting pressure on Kenny Hill, and you saw some of the inexperience by that team. A lot of young players on the offensive side of the ball. They dropped a lot of passes. They weren't able to step up in the moment. I know they're home, but in my opinion, Ole Miss is the more complete team with the veteran quarterback. I like Ole Miss's chances on the road. I think they get the upset over A&M.
Well, we talked about it in the offseason. Ole Miss brought back 10 starters on defense, and it was a defense that wasn't elite, but it was extremely good, and it was coming, and we could see that it was coming and had the chance to be an elite defense. And by all indications, against Memphis 2 weeks ago and against Alabama, they have a chance of being a special defense. Like you said, I think you said it in one summary statement there, Ole Miss is the more complete team. We'll see if they've reached the level where they can go through the gauntlet and they can get high for Alabama, come up with the emotional win, and then they can maintain that and go on the road and beat Texas A&M, because that's what the truly great teams are able to do, is withstand that kind of competition 2 and 3 and maybe 4 games in a row. And that's what Ole Miss is going to have to do in the SEC Western Division. All right, let's finish up on the West Coast with USC. How'd they blow it against Arizona State? And so they're in a world of hurt with 2 conference losses. Well, no, they lost to Boston College, so they just have the one Pac-12 loss, and they're taking on the surprise of the Pac-12. Rich Rod's got Arizona at number 10, and again, I'm going to credit the voters for just saying, you know what, we might have missed it on Arizona, and shoot, Arizona could still lose 3 or 4 games, but at least to date, they're 5-0. And they've won 2 conference games, and they won at Oregon. Let's credit them for that and place them in the top 10. So we got Arizona hosting USC.
Interesting matchup. Arizona whipped USC 2 years ago, and Matt Barkley, a very convincing win at home. I like Arizona because of their physicality on defense, Mark. Very physical. They're able to create pressure on the quarterback, and they're solid in run support. And you look at their freshman quarterback, Solomon, makes great decisions in the pocket, puts his team in a position to score points on every drive, and I think they're playing better than USC right now. How USC lost that game game is beyond belief because they had a 9-point lead early in the second half going into the fourth quarter. And when you look at that jump ball, it looked like Jalen Strong was the only person that wanted it. USC's defenders didn't jump up and knock the ball down. They waited for it to come down, and that's why they got the loss at home in the Coliseum. I like Arizona because of their defensive front, and I think that they have more in the tank emotionally, and I think you'll see some consistency this week against USC. The numbers suggest USC should win this ball game. 8-29 all time against USC. Arizona is, but I still like the Wildcats. I like the program that Rich Rod is building, and I think that the loss last week really solidified that USC is a mediocre team this year.
And what we saw at Arizona, we expect the up-tempo offense. We expect them to be able to throw the ball and score points. They've done that since Rich Rod has arrived. But what we saw against Oregon was them take advantage of a beat-up offensive line at Oregon and put the pressure on Mariota. We saw them match up physically against elite wide receivers, and Allen for Oregon in particular is a burner, a Pac-12 high hurdler, guy that's a track star in the Pac-12, and they were able to tackle in space and contain and not allow the big play, and that was impressive out of Arizona. All right, Joe, that's the wrap on Week 7. I expect this to be an exceptional week because we've got some serious matchups, and I don't think it's going to stop the rest of the season. It's chaotic. I can't weed through these teams to pick out 4 at this point for the college football playoff. I just think it's going to be crazy from here to championship week.
I agree with you. The one thing that we're not seeing, Mark, is we're not seeing consistency. We're not seeing consistency from the top teams week to week, and I think that's what's making this year such a special season, is that every single week another team seems to get knocked off. We're not seeing a consistent effort from the top 10 teams week in and week out like we're used to seeing, and that's why it looks like it's going to go down to the wire. It's a race to the finish. What 4 teams will be standing at the end, we'll have to see, but it has more twists and turns than a soap opera at this point.
Yeah, right now, if you talk about the only teams in the country that have beaten multiple good teams, meaning just didn't have that one breakout game and they knocked off an Oregon like Arizona did, but Auburn, they've stood up against 3 pretty good teams in Kansas State, LSU, and Arkansas, and I know that they're not top 25 or top 15 teams when you talk about those 3, but they're decent, they're quality teams, and they've knocked off those 3 and dominated 2 of them. Mississippi State as well, again at LSU, and again the Tigers are down, but they still have a ton of talent. But Mississippi State's now done it against Texas A&M and LSU, and Florida State against Oklahoma State, and without Jameis Winston against Clemson. I've got to give them some credit for as much as I knock their schedule. They've done it against those 2 quality football teams as well.
Good point. Excellent point. I think that maybe the voters got it wrong too. Maybe we didn't have the right 25 teams in the poll to start the year, because it seems like the cream is starting to rise to the top. I agree with you. I like Auburn as the number 1 team in the country because of Nick Marshall, because of the way that offense is starting to gel at this point in the season. And you mentioned 3 solid victories against Kansas State, against LSU last week, and against Arkansas, quality wins at this point in the season. So you're absolutely right when you look at Mississippi State as well. But where were they to start the year? They weren't even ranked in some of the polls. So I think the voters got it wrong as to how we viewed these teams in the preseason, and now you're starting to see the teams that are built for the long haul starting to rise in the polls, and you can't take away from the Seminoles. I agree. It's just that I feel like they seem to just think that they can walk out onto the field and win ball games and not put in a consistent effort week in and week out. Last week was the only time that I saw the Seminoles defense really step up and shut down an opposing offense. After that, prior to that, they've been challenged every other week on the road or at home. They haven't shut down one offense, in my opinion.
All right, Joe, we love the breakdown of the top 25 and look forward to a Week 7. Enjoy the games, and we will see you soon.
Sounds great, Mark. I love being a part of it. You have a great show. Can't wait for next week.